everyone, and welcome to Chattanooga Faith Work Culture's March Lunch and Learn event. We're so honored that you would take time out of your day to join us, whether you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, or recorded at a later time. We hope that the content that we provide is a tool for you to use as you navigate what it means to live out the gospel in your everyday life. My name is Jonathan Ingraham. I'm the Executive Director of Chattanooga Faith Work Culture. We're a nonprofit here in Chattanooga that desires to equip Christians on what it means to live out the gospel in their work, in their community, and in their civic engagement. We offer lots of opportunities for you to engage with our material through fellowships, online content, and other things that you can see by visiting our websites. We encourage you to check it out and to see what's there. You can also sign up for our newsletter to keep up with the things that we're providing for you all. This month for our Lunch and Learn series, we'll be looking at a sobering topic and looking at mental health in the workplace. In the height of COVID-19 this past year, over 40% of people have reported struggling with mental health or substance abuse. During the same time, the rate of depression in the United States has tripled. And studies are showing that job loss and income loss are leading to a rise in anxiety and depression. In this limited amount of time that we have today, and in the conversations that we go through, I pray that it would be an encouragement to you as you leave with the beginning of learning what it means to navigate this time in your personal life, but also in your relationship with your family, with your neighbors, and with your coworkers. I'm thankful that I'm not having this conversation by myself, but joined by a wonderful panel of counselors that are here in Chattanooga that are going to be joining us today. So I'm going to introduce them real quick. Before we get started. So Shan Alexander is a licensed professional counselor and has worked at Covenant College for 15 years, as well as having a small private practice for 30 years, presently housed at New City Fellowship in Glenwood. Her heart is to journey with people through the matters of life and pressing into the gospel with an integrated approach of mind, body, and soul, specializing in trauma recovery. She's married to Wesley and the mother of 4 adult children. She enjoys hospitality, music and worship, and laughter and family. We're also joined by MyChelle Richardson-Pinkerton, and she's a licensed marriage and family therapist in a private practice with the Journey Psychotherapy Center. And she works with couples, families, and individuals struggling with relationship difficulties, sexual issues, anxiety, and depression. And she also works with those struggling with emotional challenges from pregnancy and pregnancy loss, grief and loss, and adjustment to life transitions. MyChelle resides in Chattanooga with her husband and their precious sons, 2 sons. And we also have Russell Courtney with us today. He's the Director of Spiritual Direction at Elbow Tree Christian Counseling. He's a trained spiritual director and soul care practitioner with a master's in spiritual formation and soul care from Denver Seminary. He desires to walk with people as they journey towards wholeness and wholehearted living. Russell also lives in Chattanooga with his wife and his 2 sons. Thank you all so much for joining us and being a part of this today.
Absolutely.
That's great to be here.
Yeah. Well, before we jump into questions, I want to remind those that are watching that as we're talking and engaging with these issues, as you think of questions and things come to your mind that you hope that we can touch on, I would encourage you in the comment section of YouTube or LinkedIn or Facebook, go ahead and write questions in the comment section. We'll be able to see those throughout our time. And at the end of our assigned questions that we have, we're going to try to engage with as many of those topics as we can to end out our time together today. So with that, I want to just jump into it with a question for all of you to engage with. Over this past year, you all have continued meeting with clients, whether that's virtually or in person, and going and walking with them through the things that they're thinking about and struggling with in this time. I would love for you all just to give us an overview of what you're seeing generally from people spiritually, emotionally, and mentally, and how's that manifesting in light of the pandemic and the civil unrest that we've dealt with over the past year. And we'll just do a popcorn style so anyone can answer whenever they're ready.
Well, it's a great time to open up the discussion because all of this kind of went down this time last year. And I think we're all kind of processing and trying to get our heads around what did just happen. It all feels so surreal. Mm-hmm. And it's impacted each one of us in unique ways. And so the biggest thing that I feel in touch with myself personally and most of the folks that have been impacted is just a deep state of grief. We've all had, whether it's the high school student that didn't have prom and graduation, all the way to death and loss and really traumatic events, especially among our healthcare professionals. Just different grades of loss that has caused a deep lament to go up, and hopefully we can talk more about that. The other piece I would say is that we're just been on such a rapid learning curve of how to do life and how to change that we're just all exhausted. And it's impacted us in deep ways through anxiety and depression, as you read out the statistics earlier. And suicide rates are higher, drugs and addiction rates are higher, even things like gaining weight. I read an article yesterday that even children gain 2 pounds a month through the pandemic. And so it's lots of layers of impact there.
Yeah, and to piggyback on what Shan was mentioning, the effects to our sense of community and the changes in how we maintain that. For many of us, we're working from home. For some of our kiddos, we are in like a virtual learning environment. And so that person-to-person, face-to-face interaction looks completely different now. And so struggling with what that is, or if you happen to be a transplant, like if you had just arrived in Chattanooga and you are excited to start a new job and then everything goes virtual, figuring out what that looks like. And so that sense of isolation that can be a contributor to the depression and the anxiety that people are wrestling with.
Yeah, I for me, I think 2 things kind of come to my mind. I think of like most of the folks that I meet with are walking in during the pandemic, whether it's virtual or in person. I think a lot of the same problems exist in everyone's life. So whether it's the trauma, the grief that anyone's kind of carrying and always has carried, it really just in this year feels like it just magnifies and kind of in your face even closer and even more, because there's so much time now to be alone, to be isolated, to be more downtime, more margin sometimes in folks' life. And I think that's often intimidating, to be that alone with your grief, with your trauma. And so it just feels like it's magnified 100 times. But it's also, I mean, I love how the question's worded in a way like, how are we seeing it affect in other people's lives? When honestly, if I'm pretty honest about this question, I think it's affected my own life in significant ways as well. So I've had to walk through this year with, question. I mean, it's always been questions for me that I've had, but I think in light of COVID, it's been just in my face more, like I said. So questions like, okay, what does it look like to walk through bouts of depression? What does it look like to walk through this anxiety myself, and journeying with people with it as well?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Thank you all for sharing about what you're experiencing internally, but also externally, but also internally, that we all are experiencing, that we can relate with. Shan, I want to ask you a specific question. I know a big portion of those that you are meeting with in your practice are college students that are navigating this time, a lot of times away from home on a college campus and trying to figure out what it means to do this in this time. Would you be able to talk a little bit, what are some of the anxieties and stressors particularly that they're feeling, and then how are you helping them navigate that? Or what are some tools that you're trying to give them in this moment?
Yeah. Well, as we kind of continue on with the theme of loss, it's taken a lot of different pictures for college students. Again, those high school seniors that didn't get prom and graduation, to the college seniors who didn't get to graduate, and kind of commemorate and have those milestones that have always been true in the history of our nation. But in addition to that, there have been folks who have had extended periods of lockdown with their family. And if they come from a supportive family and there's good relationships there, sometimes that's been a blessing. But the other side of it is that once you've gained the independence of going off to college, to go back into a period of lockdown is a real difficult thing for a 20-year-old. In addition to that, several folks couldn't get jobs, so they had lots of time on their hands, which contributes to depression and the isolation, the lack of community. And one thing that we've not heard addressed a whole lot, but international students were really, I'm going to use the word at least little t trauma in the threat of being deported last spring when all of this was going down. And yet many couldn't get into their countries. They didn't have the money to travel, but there was this threat of deportation and being displaced. And that was really difficult on that portion of our population. And then with the racial unrest and mask wearing and things, we all fall on this really different continuum of how we hold that, how we process that. And ironically, that's another place where the generations have experienced some discrepancy with each other. And so even that issue has brought conflict with each other in our communities, but especially among the generations between young folks and their parents. So the other thing I would say is that, coming back to campus, campus, the procedural protocol has changed. And so oftentimes, like on our college campus, it's discouraged to go off campus into social settings. It's discouraged to go off your hall to do social events. And so this is contributing to isolation. And God forbid that you get a COVID exposure, because then you go into 2 weeks of quarantine, which is medically, of course, the right thing to do, to be very cautious. But most of us, when we've gone into quarantine, we can still hop in our car and drive around town or go for a walk. And these students are not able to do that. And so there has been really serious repercussions on folks' mental health because of that. And no spring break for colleges who are not taking it. Ours is not. And so the list could go on. And again, this is not a statement against protocol. Folks are trying to be careful and trying to be wise stewards, but it does have repercussions on folks' mental health.
Shan, as you're navigating this with students, what are things that you want to encourage them on, or if someone's listening in on this call and they're resonating with some of the things that you just described, how would you encourage folks in this time to process that, and where would you encourage them to turn?
Well, we use the word process a lot around these circles, but ironically, processing is a lot of what needs to happen. And it shouldn't be a surprise to us that a lot of us are resistant to that kind of processing. So learning to be still, learning to actively lament, learning to breathe and be in the moment and allow these times for God to teach us something, for us to kind of take new evaluations about the promises of God, and being able to process through the losses that we have. And hopefully as we do that, our capacity is increased in being able to, we're not a wartime generation. We haven't gone through what former, civilizations and generations have gone. And so hopefully, this is our war. We have to build the resiliency to kind of process that. And so, learning to take care of ourselves, to be mindful, to notice what we're feeling, to feel what we're feeling, to use things like journaling and connecting with people to express and to grieve, and the power of music and mantras and all of these kinds of things are tools that we teach in counseling to just help people form those new daily rhythms that I think Russell will probably talk more about, to kind of help us get through, and hopefully to do that in ways that we're all practicing and helping each other with in community.
That's good. Yeah, I definitely feel the sense as talking to people in that age bracket of loss of community. But what I'm realizing is that's not only specific to that age bracket. And MyChelle, a question I have for you, as our work world has changed, so many people being forced on a drop of a hat to move from going into an office every day and having coworkers that they're with to working remotely, to working from home, isolated, trying to keep the kids away, trying to do all these things, and they're working from home. Some folks who have lost their jobs during the pandemic are having to try to do the job search remotely, and isolation and fear and unknown, and that's all there. What does it look like as you think about the workplace that are changing rapidly, that we aren't just robots that do work, but that we do it relationally? What's it look like to think about healthy relationships in this new world we find ourselves in, at least for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, absolutely. There have been so many changes on how we look at work, on what we think work should look like, and even that work-life balance that we all strive for. So for those who might have found themselves, again, being transplants to the city, starting this new job, and then all of a sudden you're doing it remotely. So you don't even get the culture of your new workplace. It's very difficult to establish those relationships, to feel like you're part of the team and you're not just on this island by yourself. Then you've got those who are trying to figure out, how do I do work at home? And if my kiddos are here doing school, I'm having to monitor them, especially if they're younger and not as independent, while still being a productive person at work. So all these things contribute to that feeling of like isolation and heightened stress, heightened anxiety with some of that. So in thinking about maintaining and even establishing some of those relationships, we got to think outside of the box. Technology is great. It's time to shine during this time period. Many workplaces have a preferred platform for inter-office communication, whether that's, Teams or Slack. I know our group, we use Slack. And so for those, like, be very active on that. Don't let it take up your whole day, but maybe 15 to 20 minutes a day. Try to interact with your coworkers. If you're new to that place of employment, who's on your team, your specific team, and then take 15, 20 minutes a day to just reach out to one person on that team to begin to establish that relationship. In establishing relationships, it might be difficult for them to get your personality. I'm very sarcastic. I use a lot of humor, which if I'm typing, it might not come across like I would like for it to, but I might have to be a little creative. Maybe I use more video chat, maybe, every now and then a picture to try to get that feel for my personality across. And then in terms of just work-life balance, being on a screen all day long is draining, whether you are in school or whether this is for your work. And so I think you've got to be more intentional about breaking it up, taking breaks. When we see ourselves on the screen, our brains think we're getting all that good person-to-person interaction and all those wonderful hormones that are released with person-to-person interaction. But the fact of the matter is, we're not getting that. We just see each other. And so it's almost like our brain is doing double time, trying to figure out what is going on. Why am I not getting the good stuff, but yet I see this person? So you've got to take breaks, or you're going to be completely exhausted. And once you reach that place of exhaustion, you don't have much to give for your family when it's, family time. Another thing to consider is, because we're not working at another place, we don't get the benefit of having a commute to work. Oftentimes people would use that commute to kind of decompress from the day and do that transition from work to home life. Now, sometimes your commute is from the kitchen table to the living room. So finding ways to be a little bit more intentional about going through that transition, whether you take a few moments off to yourself to kind of release the day, whether you do that with some breathing, some yoga stretches, some meditation, to just transition from work self to home self. Those are just some things that can help alleviate some of the stressors and the things that hit our mental health from being remote.
Yeah, it's a big thing. And you guys are hitting such important things of what the issues are and some real practical things to try to meet those needs. I just want to remind folks as they're watching, if you have questions that are popping up in your heart and your mind, feel free to write them in the comments. We're going to try to engage those at the end of our time. Russell, isolation has been talked about, lack of community. I think a big thing too, on top of isolation, is the fear of the unknown. There's a sense of, how am I supposed to plan for the future when I'm having a hard time planning for later today about what the world's going to look like? I'm trying to follow what the CDC is recommending, and it's changing as they're learning as they go. I would love, what do I do in the job market in this crazy time when I'm not sure what I should be doing? Where do my skills fit in? One thing that I really appreciate about you, and I actually have Russell meets with all my Chattanooga fellows every year to talk through some of these things, but I'd love for you just to kind of talk through what are some practices as we think about all the turmoil that we feel in our heart that around unknown and fear and isolation that you think would be really good for us to build into our life to promote peace and joy in the settings we find ourselves.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I think there are a number of practices, but one in particular, especially in light of the last year that we've had, and I think often a forgotten art and a forgotten practice among those who claim to follow Jesus is the art and the practice of blessing others. And what I mean by blessing others is really attempting to call out the worth, the dignity, the image of God in other people. So that whether that's the folks that I meet with individually at my office or whether that's just people and friendships in general in my life. And not only me blessing others, but me posturing my heart and putting, I think, relationships in place and circumstances where I too can receive blessing. And the best example of this that I can think of is Henry Nouwen. We all know Henry Nouwen's famous priest and theologian and taught at Notre Dame, Harvard, Yale, spoke around the world, and then chose to live the last decade of his life with severe mental illness, severe physical disabilities with folks. And there's one particular story, for instance, that took place when he was leading a worship service for some of these folks that he was living with in a group home. And one of the ladies, I believe her name was Janet, asked for, she raised her hand in the middle of the service and asked Henry Nouwen to bless her. And he kind of did the motion with his thumb and did the cross on her forehead. And she's like, no, I want a real blessing. And he proceeded to tell her, like, Janet, your smile lights up the room. You are so kind to everyone, and you are the beloved child of God. And there's not a day that goes by without God loving you, and really personalized the message. And then other people started raising their hand in the room asking for a blessing. That's what I mean by blessing others. And I think we're all very quick. If we have a default mode, we're pretty quick, and you can see, just log on to Facebook and look how many people are literally just the opposite of blessing one another. We're cursing one another, literally cursing and saying what we don't like about someone rather than like, where can we find the image of God in other people? And I think our ultimate example is the life of Jesus. And in the Gospels, it took place in Jesus's life. There's only two places in Scripture in Jesus's life where the Father blesses his Son and said, "This is my beloved Son with whom I'm well pleased." The Transfiguration in Jesus's baptism. And what fascinates me, and I had not heard this until a handful of years ago, but at Jesus's baptism, when the clouds ripped open and the Father blesses his Son and says, "This is my beloved Son with whom I'm well pleased," that was prior to Jesus having done one single thing on the planet yet. And for me, that alone, that fact alone, that truth, the fact that Jesus hadn't done one thing yet, and the Father speaking his love over his Son, is just permission for each of us that we too can receive blessing, even when it's not deserved or earned or worked for. And often we are trying to earn, work, and strive for what it means to, receive kind words from someone else. It's only if we deserve it or only if we worked for it. So I think the practice of trying to bless other people, and that can be in small ways, where we offer other people kind words, where we look for ways that we see the image of God, because every single pair of eyes that we stare into, that we come across in life, have the image of God imprinted on them. And where can we find that? Because we're so quick to find all the other things. And so I think that's been always, just for me, a really good reminder and practice to find the image of God in other people, and offer blessing, and also put myself in a position where I can receive a blessing as well, because it's just as hard to receive, maybe even harder to be on the receiving end of a blessing than it is, to give it. So those of us who are always giving also need to learn how to receive a blessing as well.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That is such a good reminder of words of truth and words of encouragement, and what it means to receive them, but also what it's doing in us when we give them. Thank you for that reminder. Well, this question I have for you guys, this is for everyone. I'd love to hear everyone's response on this. As we're thinking about responding in this moment, one thing that is really important is you all are coming from a place of faith. As counselors, you're in practices where you're working with people and helping them work through the things in their heart and life, but you're also believers that follow Jesus and trust in him. And as already been mentioned, this year you're not a robot in this year. You've been wrestling through your own, how to navigate this past year and all the complexities of it yourself. We can't even as we were preparing for this talk, since then, things have happened, whether it was what happened last week in the Atlanta area, or even yesterday in Boulder, Colorado. There is so much unrest. Too many things to name over the course of the year, on top of being in a pandemic that we're not only, you all aren't helping other people with, but navigating yourself. And so I would just love to know how is your faith informing the work you do for others and the care you have for yourself, and what drives your hope in the midst of these challenging times?
Well, what comes to my mind, I love the phrase and the wording, what drives your hope. I think for me, it's been the Eugene Peterson, when he writes the words about the Psalms, when he redid the Message version of the Bible, and he has this phrase, even a book title, called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. For me, that phrase always strikes me. And I think that gives me, I don't know, the idea that this is a journey, a pilgrimage. It takes time. It's long. It's arduous. There are moments of elation. There's moments of, deep, dark despair. And so this idea of the long obedience in the same direction for me is kind of, there are going to be days that it feels in my own life where it feels like I'm taking steps backwards. There are days when I feel like I'm taking a few steps forward. But yeah, I love that phraseology by Eugene. And I also think this idea of putting in perspective that my hope, I'm not always going to necessarily experience sustained, whatever word you like, contentment, happiness, everything is great, everything is okay. When I think often what I can expect, and I think what we can hope for is, I love the word glimpses, taste, and moments. Those are the things we can experience with one another in relationship and with our relationship with God. Those are the things we can hope for, not this, sustained euphoria or whatever. But I love that phrase, long obedience in the same direction.
Yeah, that's really good. I would say that for myself, and I would imagine the other members of the panel as well, seeing the work that we do as being a calling, even this is how we minister to others, and with some of the intense, really hard wrestlings that people are experiencing with the hard things that we have seen in our country, especially around race relations, of really ministering to those who would be considered the least of these and creating a space, maybe even a space that they didn't even realize they needed, to be able to lament, to be able to cry out and wrestle with the questions of the why, but also creating that space where it's like we're in the now, but the not yet. Right now, it hurts. Right now, it is hard. Right now, it feels like a lot of pressure, but the not yet is coming. And being a reminder of that, not as a, oh, just skip over your pain, let's move on to the next piece, but we hold both and they don't cancel each other out. And seeing that as a very real, beautiful part of our ministry that we get to do.
Beautiful sentiments from both of you. I think just coming back to the basics of the promises in the midst of the lament has been huge for me personally. And I always feel as part of that calling of a counselor, it's kind of like when we went into grad school, the 101 class, we thought we were showing up to save the world, and the professor says, you don't have any right to be in this seat until you've been in that one. So everybody go sign up for counseling. And I feel like it's kind of my duty to kind of, before the Lord, but also in the calling, to always wrestle with what everybody else is wrestling with. Otherwise, we just become this kind of detached, brains on a stick kind of mentality. And so in the midst of the lament, coming back to these promises that we know we have been promised suffering. We know this is part of the calling of Christ, and somehow leaning into the reality that if Christ suffered, we will as well. But that the battered and bruised church will go on. Like, we have this promise that the remnant will move forward. We may be bloody and forlorn. We may be quabbling and squabbling. We may have lots of difficulties, but the remnant will move forward. And so coming back and just really being able to sit in the realities that Christ is with us, just that he breathes in me, that I can abide in him, that I can't do anything without him, that he is the vine and we are the branches, and just finding new and fresh ways to sit in those realities and offer that hope to others as well.
Oh, that's really good. Something you guys have all mentioned is that we are facing challenges, and as believers that we shouldn't shy away from that. A lot of times scripture talks though about like the joy is coming, but we often skip right over where we are now. The word lament has been thrown around a few times today in our conversation. And I don't know if any of you would be willing to kind of talk. We're starting to hit that a little bit with this conversation, but how do we engage with hard moments, and what does it mean as a Christian to grieve and lament well? What does lament mean, and how do we do it well in ways that push us towards our faith in the Lord, and not things that put resentment in our heart? Would you have any words of encouragement for folks that are tuning in on that specific question? Anyone in the panel?
I mean, what immediately comes to my mind is a therapist that I know in Birmingham, Alabama, that led a grief and loss retreat at one point a handful of years ago. And I remember him telling everybody that was arriving at the retreat was coming with grief and loss, and some of it pretty significant. So a death in the immediate family you name it. And there was significant grief. And he was saying, obviously, you're arriving on a Friday afternoon and we're leaving on a Sunday. Should we expect that everyone's going to walk away Sunday, with high fives and happy and leaving completely healed and, ready to move forward? And the idea that he gave was that he used the word countenance, and he said, I hope that when you leave on Sunday, that your countenance is held higher than when you came in on Friday. And for me, that's just such a good, I like the word, but I also love the imagery and the visual of the idea of like kind of coming in with your head down and leaving with a little bit more of your head up, not meaning problems are gone, but there is a little bit of movement. There is a little bit of my countenance being held higher. And I just always remembered him kind of saying that. And it has been helpful as I look at my own lament, my frustrations, my doubts, my fears, questions, that maybe a prayer could be that my countenance would be held a little higher than it is in the moment, you know?
Yeah, when I move into lament, I'm thinking about David in the Psalms, Jeremiah, Job. We have great examples there of just an honest showing up with an authentic, vulnerable self. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really counterintuitive, especially in an American culture, to want to show up vulnerably. We're very self-protective. We're very production-oriented. Even in our grief, we just want to get to it. We want to bury our dead on Thursday and get back to work Monday morning, And we have a lot to learn as a culture about lament. But I think just showing up before the Lord, unto the Lord, in all of our honesty, whether that's anger, or bewilderment, whatever it looks like, being vulnerable before him and then just pouring it out. Lament is active. It's to be felt, it's to be named, and then it's this active pouring out in an unedited kind of way. And as we do that, sometimes that moves toward repentance, and sometimes that moves toward sadness, and sometimes it moves towards more rejoicing, and it can take a lot of different shapes and can't be packaged, but that's what I think of with lament, a form of worship.
Absolutely. And I would, in talking about lament, and especially in some of the harder things that we have experienced in our country, I encourage people to really tap into that empathy part of them. It may not have happened to you. You may not have had a stake in the game or a dog in the fight, but you can tap into that empathy and step and get into their shoes. Even if you don't necessarily, quote unquote, agree, there's pain there, and we can tap into that and feel that and cry out on their behalf. And that is a form of ministry as well. Oftentimes it's almost, that's a different kind of gift, right? Like, I can mourn and I can grieve and I can say, you know what, your pain is worth it. Your pain, like, I honor you in that way, that image of God in you, I'm going to cry out on your behalf for that. Mm-hmm. And so where do you feel that in your body, like in your gut, or if even if it's this, and again, in our society, we're very put together, right? And especially in my particular denomination, we are packaged really well. And so to have just those guttural, just sobs and weeping and yells, because it's a very active grief and sorrow for somebody else's, like, on their behalf. That is a beautiful form of just, that's how you love your neighbor well, right?
That's good. These are all really good examples of really we needing to take time in the midst of this, not to just stay busy, but to slow down enough to process and to do these things. Just real quick for folks, if you do have questions, we're going to end in a few minutes. So throw them in the comment section and we'll get to those. But my last question for you all is this: if someone's listening to this and they're saying, that's really good, I want to do those practices, but I got to go to work today. I have to go to work, whether that's in person or go stare at my computer again today. And I have to put on a face, but internally I'm really struggling with the things that are happening in racial unrest in our country, or I'm really struggling with what it means to feel alone in my work. would you all have any practical encouragement to give to someone for today, where they find themselves in a space like that as they leave this call and leave their lunch break and head back to the office or their computer?
I'll jump in there.
That's you, Russell.
All right. I mean, bare bones practical, and these are often things that I think I offer them to others because it was something that was offered to me, and things that I continue to try to offer myself. And you mentioned the idea of busyness, and we need to take the time to slow down, hit the pause button, almost like, what is it? I mean, really, I think the ultimate question is, what does it mean to Sabbath? Meaning to cease. So how do we cease? And I think we can cease in little moments, not bite off more than we can chew. So make our goals actually reachable and attainable, rather than the January 1st New Year's resolutions we make that don't make it to the 2nd. But that we actually, for me, it's hopping in the car, and I know anywhere in Chattanooga, I have 10, 15-minute commute. And instead of pushing the power button to turn on the radio, the podcast, the music, I just drive in quiet and use that as a time to be still and to quiet my mind, to practice breathing, to notice where am I. Even as silly as it may sound, like I have actually done this a few times, but actually driving somewhere and driving the speed limit, not because I want to obey the law or because I do normally speed, but I actually find out real quickly why my heart and why I'm in a hurry. Like I find myself feeling rushed and panicked all the time. And what is it? Am I fearful of what others are going to think of me if I'm late? Am I what is it that's driving this hurried, harried kind of thing in my heart that makes me feel so rushed? So I think there are practical things while we're at work, or if you're at work and you get the 5-minute break and you can walk outside, take 5 minutes in your day, literally, to just cease and stop all of your doing. Don't take the phone with you. Don't look at text. Don't look at emails. Look up at the sky, be in nature. Even if it's just a couple minutes, those things can be extremely helpful. And it not be that, I need to take a chunk of my time today to practice being alone and notice my breath. Yes, that can be great and very helpful and beneficial, but practically speaking, those little small 5-minute breaks during our day can be huge.
Mm-hmm. The only thing I would add on to that is, right now, talk about boundaries with toxic people is all the rage. It's a huge topic that a lot of people are talking about, but this is kind of dabbing into that idea of that we have to have boundaries with ourselves. And, it's okay to shelf grief. We all have to get up and go do something. It's okay to put it on the shelf, knowing that it's kind of there and letting it seep in the background. The problem is when we don't come back to it. Or when we just let all of our crazy thoughts take root and not practice putting a boundary with our ruminating, and our obsessing, so that we can kind of, as Russell's saying, be still. And so those kind of boundaries are not just something that we practice with other people. It's something that we have to practice within ourselves. And they do take practice, daily practice, because they're hard to do.
Mm-hmm. Tagging on what Shan was saying, I often teach the exercise of the container of, if you have these big emotions, and I do this a lot with my kiddos, these big emotions, but we've got stuff to do. Stuff has to get done. So whatever container you want to put it in, it could be a glass jar, it could be a traveling trunk, it could be Tupperware. Imagine putting that feeling or those thoughts, put it in that container, seal it, put it on the shelf. We'll come back to it when we have a bigger space of time to kind of process through that. But that way it's not just running through your mind. Your brain knows, okay, we're not going to forget it because we contained it, but I can make space and do what I've got to do. And I can come back to that to apply some of those skills that might take more than 5 or 10 minutes to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good thing. I love that idea of the grief is there and this idea of shelving it or containing it for a season. But Shan, you're right. That idea of coming back to it, that's a scary thing, but it's an important thing for sure. Well, we had one question come in. I want to read to you guys, and I'd love your feedback. This could be a great way to end this time. But the question is, among working adults, the idea that we are in control used to be a widely accepted idea. Strategic plans, goals, and objectives, budget management, performance appraisals all provide illusions of control. This past year has shown us that we, in fact, control very little, which has been fearsome and disorienting for many people. Can you provide some encouragement to those who are dealing with that precarious sense and loss of control?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, that nails it, doesn't it? I mean, that almost summarizes our year, a loss of control. And so I think there's a spiritual inclination here, and then there's the more practical piece of it. But spiritually speaking, this whole concept of severe mercy is that God is the great disruptor. He's constantly trying to displace our illusions of control. And I think the more that we can kind of lean into that, it is a severe mercy because it wounds us deeply in our pride and our DNA that we want so badly to have it all together. And leaning into this in ways that are humble, that recognizes there is a God and we are not it, and learning to submit, even if that's on a minute by minute or hourly basis, it is huge. And then the more practical level of that is working into the workplace. You know, I love the serenity prayer. Lord, help me with it. Just think of it on the spot. To accept the things that we cannot change, the wisdom to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I butchered that a little bit, but that's the essence of it. And so, you know, those places in the workplace that we can still show up to and kind of through God's power, affect change and affect places to move and produce, then we can do that. But hopefully it's with this new humbled posture that we've learned this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that sums up, the question sums up really well that drive in all of us to tell me I'm doing a good job. Let me prove to you I can do this on my own, which we do have that posture and we do need to remain in that humble space. And so my bent in terms of if I were working with that person is to, where are those places maybe in their past, in their childhood, where there was a need that wasn't met and it continues to show up in that question of, tell me I'm doing a good job. Tell me I'm earning your attention. In how can we, in a healthier manner, meet that need? What would that look like? How do we self-soothe in those moments, whether it's through breathing, whether it's through taking those strategic breaks throughout the day to recenter, and remind ourselves, like, I bring so much more to the table than my productivity. And maybe even just having that visual reminder. I often have people draw a big old circle on a piece of paper, and in that circle, write everything you know to be true of you. What are your strengths? So that you can look at it and say, that's who I am. And anything outside of that, someone is trying to lie about who I am, which would create an anxiety in us. They're speaking stuff on us that's not me. And so having those reminders that it's so much more than I made budget. It's so much more that I completed that task on time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for me, I really appreciated whoever wrote that or asked that question. I couldn't agree more with and resonate more with the word illusion. That control is absolutely an illusion, and it has fooled me many times. And even though I'm aware cognitively right now as I'm speaking that it's an illusion, there are moments ahead of me where I'm going to think that I've got things under control or things, in my grasp. And unfortunately, I don't know if this is the encouraging part, but for me, and I know a lot of others, that we've all learned the hard way. Like, it's this idea that, we're all born. I forget what the reflex is called when a baby is born. You stick your finger out and the baby grabs onto your finger. We're literally born with this propensity to grasp and to hang on to and to get a hold of, and from birth, literally from birth. And we spend our whole lives like with these clenched fists trying to grab whatever it is we can to control. And man, like we're usually, our fingers, God is teaching us often by, prying our fingers, off of what we're grabbing onto. So I think for us, it's just like, what does it look like to live more open-handed, and how do we even practice and place our lives in such a way where our hands can be open rather than clenched? And that conversation could be, we could continue in this conversation for days and always. So I think it's very true. And I think this year, right, I mean, it has shown, like, a lot of us have been duped about control, and then things show up and we get hit in the head with a 2x4 in life and realize that we don't have control. And then that 2x4 hits us again,
No, I think that's good. I hear, one thing I hear in all of your answers is this idea of where our identities lie. And this idea that our identities are actually being held in the love of God. It's a simple concept to get with our brains, but to feel in our hearts and our lives is something we have to wrestle with always. And it shows up not just in our what we call our quote unquote spiritual lives on church or in our Bible studies. It shows up in the workplace. And this question really hit at that of like, the control I feel at work is speaking to how I actually view who's in control of my life and how I get my worth. So great answers on that. I want to thank each of you. Thank you for taking an hour of your day. I know you guys talk a lot already to do this and to engage this topic for people to think about what it means in light of this year to navigate the things that they're feeling in their heart and in their mind. There's so much more we did not talk about, but I hope this was, for those listening, I hope it was a great way to start the conversation as you're caring for yourself and those that are around you. So thank you guys very much for being with us today.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Jonathan.
It was an honor. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you guys who are tuning in and engaging with this content. I pray that it was helpful for you. We want to provide resources for those in Chattanooga to engage with throughout the year. And so encourage you to stay in touch with what we're doing. Again, check out our website, sign up for our newsletter. We would love to have you be a part of it. But as you head into your work week, I pray that this was an encouragement to you, and go and remembering that your identity is in the love of God. And as you enter these tasks, holding them open-handed and for what the Lord has for you is really good. Blessings, and look forward to more Lunch and Learns with you in the future.